Hello and welcome back to Gubb Farm. I have spent about 10-ish hours a week over the last couple of months doing a very tedious job, and that is trimming the grass around the trees. So at the start of last year I broke my shoulder just after I planted the trees, and I wasn't able to tend to them during the summer months, so they got very overgrown. So I have spent the winter so far just cutting back around the trees, cutting back the grass, getting them ready for mulching. And the big issue I have is what's making it such a slow process is I've had to put a cage around the trees as part of a grant, and that means getting down on my hands and knees with a pair of grass cutters or hedge cutters to trim around the tree underneath the wire. So I'm now down to the last 90, so I should finish it today, and then I can get ready for mulching around the trees. And what I'd like to talk about is some of the pros and cons of putting cages around trees. You know, the issue I have, the main threat I have is deer, and as I speak to you I'm just looking at all the footprints in the ground which are fresh. So the big issue I have is deer. I don't have rabbits, I don't have grey squirrels, voles, things like that that normally annoy people who are planting trees. Probably one of the reasons for that is that we have pine martens, so they seem to keep those sort of predator threats under control. But I do have a problem with deer, and what they do is they come in and they rub their antlers on the trees, and they can remove the bark and kill the tree. So on one hand, the cage helps protect the tree, because they rub off the cage of the tree before they make contact with the tree. But it's not that simple. What happens then is they get their head or their antlers stuck in the cage, and they rip the cage about violently, and they rip it off, and they are frequently breaking the tree. So the question is it better to have broken branches on the tree, or is it better to have, bark damage? Because ultimately below the bark damage or below the break, you have to re-establish a new leader. So I think it's kind of the same outcome. You're going to have to start again in terms of establishing a new leader, regardless of what you do. The pro is maybe it helps reduce rubbing, but it doesn't prevent it. But the big con is a massive time sink required to keep the grass cut around underneath the wire. It's just insane. So here we can see an example of a tree where the cage has been ripped off it. You can see some of the scaffolding branches have been broken, but the tree itself is still alive and will recover. If I just go over the hill slightly, I'll show you another couple of trees that were damaged. And here is the cage from that tree. You can find the cages anywhere in the field after the deer have got to them. So here we have an example of a tree where the cage has been removed and they've been rubbing at it. So they've absolutely destroyed the tree. It'll probably come back, but it's quite heavy damage. Let's see, they've got the cage of another one here. So this tree has got away light, that one's okay. So you can see that the cages, I'm not sure, I'm pretty sure about one thing, they're not worth the cost and the effort, because they don't prevent damage. They may minimise it slightly, maybe you save yourself one or two trees, but from what I can tell, I'm looking at another cage ripped off. It's a very poor deterrent for deer, and it's quite an ineffective solution. So at the first opportunity, I think these posts and cages are coming out, because the cost of trying to keep the grass cut around them is too high. It's too high on labour and just energy. I've spent all winter doing these tasks rather than more productive tasks on the farm that might add value. So as you can see here, I have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 rows to do, so about 90 trees to trim round. I start off by going down the rows with a strimmer, and it takes about an hour and a half per 100 trees, and then I go back then with a pair of hedge cutters and just trim the grass underneath the wire and pull it out, and you do about 50 an hour. So I suppose when you average it out, I'm not sure what the miles is there, it's 20-30 an hour. So it's slow work. So the grass growth on these trees isn't as bad as some of the lower, wetter bottoms. So it's not too bad to work with, but some of the trees, you can barely see the trees for the grass. So yeah, so let me give an example of the delight of cutting around trees with a pair of hedge trimmers. There is a second issue with the cages. So first of all, I have about 450 trees planted outside of the grant that doesn't have any requirement to put a cage around them, and I haven't lost any trees so far. I've got a couple with damage on them, but it's no different to, it's probably statistically similar, the damage on the caged versus the uncaged. So the first issue you have with the cages is cost. The second issue you have is time, incremental time to keep the grass cut around them. But the third and the most concerning issue is the cages are damaging the development of the scaffolding branches. In the worst examples, the scaffolding branches are turning back on themselves as they hit the cage, they're deflected by the cage, and they are going back in. The grant that I got for planting the second batch of trees was under the environmental farming scheme, and I applaud the Department of Agriculture for taking on a very thorny subject, which is the environmental impact of farming. And the scheme was designed as a Silvopasture scheme, whereby staking and caging was there to protect the newly planted trees from livestock. So my game plan was, I'll plant trees that have the potential of producing a cash crop, and then I will introduce livestock, beef, chicken. And I've run into an interesting problem. As I started to get into this and go through the work with the environmental health officer on getting ready to sell nuts if they grow, I came to realise that there is a policy that exists whereby the recommendation is not to have any livestock around any horticultural or nut products for 12 months before harvest. So the concern is that any manure from the trees could result in pathogens being passed over into the human population, into the food. There's a lot of questions around that. You know, there's so many conflicting policies out there. Some policies are happy to have animals back in the ground within 21 days after, you know, potential exposure to pathogens such as bird flu. But parking all of that aside, silvopasture is fundamentally flawed if your intention is to produce a cash crop from your trees, such as nuts, because you can't have a cycle where the trees, or there's no livestock around the trees for 12 months because harvesting is on a 12-month cycle. The only sort of options there is to have some sort of rotational plan where you take parts of the orchard out of production. Now, if you're educated in this point, you will know that you can go to your environmental health officer and you can say, well, I have a strategy for minimising any pathogens being transferred by putting down plastic sheets during harvesting, etc. And that's all well and good until you go to any of the farming schemes. So if you want to then try to shift volume of product through established distribution channels, they're going to say, well, what scheme are you part of? Because that's a way of validating that you are following good practice. And all the schemes are strictly implementing the policies as law. So even though it's only a guideline policy, and maybe you can explain to your environmental health officer that there is a better way, it's largely discounted if you try to go through established distribution networks. Now I held out from saying I'm absolutely not going to do any silvopasture because I am still wrestling with, in the coppicing forest, do I try and establish maybe turkeys, you know, get some bronze turkeys in, maybe wrestling with that, and have to think more about it. So until next time, good luck.